The gunshot echoed across the Montana prairie like thunder in a cloudless sky, causing Florence Tucker to flinch as she brought the wagon to a sudden halt. Dust billowed around her, momentarily obscuring her view of the narrow trail that wound its way through the golden grasslands toward Willow Creek. The year was 1876, and Florence had traveled nearly 500 miles to start anew, leaving behind the remains of a life that had crumbled to dust in Kansas City. "Steady there," she whispered to the horses, her gloved hands tightening on the reins. At 26 years old, Florence had seen enough of the world to know that unexpected gunfire rarely heralded anything good. She squinted into the distance, her heart pounding as she considered whether to continue forward or turn back to the last settlement she'd passed through. Before she could decide, a figure on horseback appeared over the rise, followed by another smaller rider. The lead horseman was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat. As they drew nearer, Florence could see that the second rider was just a boy, no more than 10 years old. "Madam," the man called out, raising his hand in greeting as he approached her wagon. His voice was deep and rough, like stones rolling down a mountainside. "Apologies for the shot." "Rattlesnake on the trail. Didn't mean to startle you." Florence nodded, studying him carefully. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. He wore a faded blue shirt under a worn leather vest, and his revolver had already been returned to its holster. "No harm done," she replied, releasing the breath she'd been holding. "I'm Florence Tucker, heading to Willow Creek to take up the position of schoolteacher." The man removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat with threads of silver at the temples. "Frank Lawson," he said. "This here is my son, Daniel." He gestured to the boy who rode up beside him, a smaller version of his father with bright, curious eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Tucker," Daniel said with surprising formality, though his gaze was fixed on her wagon filled with books and personal belongings. "You're the new teacher?" Frank asked, his expression impossible to read. Florence nodded. "That's right." The town council wrote that they were in desperate need after their previous teacher left rather suddenly. Frank laughed, a short, rusty sound as if he didn't use it often. "Mildred Hofstetter didn't leave so much as flee. Claimed our town was too wild and uncivilized for a woman of her standing." He shook his head. "Hope you're made of sterner stuff, Miss Tucker." "I believe I am, Mr. Lawson," Florence replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I've been teaching for 8 years, including a year at a mining camp in Colorado. Little intimidates me these days." Something flickered in Frank's eyes, respect, perhaps, or skepticism. "Well then, we're headed to town ourselves. If you'd like an escort, we'd be happy to oblige." Florence considered the offer. The journey had been long and lonely, and the thought of company, even that of strangers, was appealing. Besides, traveling with locals might offer protection from any less savory characters on the trail. "I would appreciate that, thank you." Frank and Daniel positioned their horses on either side of her wagon, and they continued along the trail together. As they traveled, Daniel peppered Florence with questions about where she'd come from and what books she'd brought, his enthusiasm for learning evident in every inquiry. "Pa says reading's important," Daniel explained. "Says a man who can't read is at the mercy of those who can." Frank looked slightly embarrassed at his son's disclosure but nodded in agreement. "My late wife, Elizabeth, taught me my letters. Always wanted Daniel to have more schooling than I did." Florence noticed how his voice softened when mentioning his wife, and how the lines around his mouth deepened with what could only be grief. "Your son seems bright," she said. "I look forward to having him in my classroom." "He's a good boy," Frank replied simply, then fell silent again. As they approached Willow Creek, Florence began to see why Mildred Hofstetter might have found the place challenging. The town was raw and rough-hewn, with muddy streets and buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. A couple of saloons appeared to be doing brisk business despite the early hour, and several men lounging outside gave Florence appraising looks as she passed. Frank noticed her expression. Town's growing faster than folks can build proper. Cattle business brings in cowboys, and the silver mine up north brings miners. Not always a gentle mix. "I didn't come west expecting gentility, Mr. Lawson," Florence replied. This drew another of his rare smiles. "No, I don't suppose you did." They stopped in front of a small building with a weathered sign declaring it the Willow Creek School. Next door was a modest cabin with a small porch. "Teacher's quarters," Frank explained. "Council had it fixed up for you. It's not much, but it's solid and dry." Florence felt a wave of relief. After weeks of travel and uncomfortable lodgings, even a simple cabin of her own sounded luxurious. "Thank you for escorting me, Mr. Lawson, Daniel," she said as she climbed down from the wagon. "I appreciate the kindness." "Pa owns the ranch just outside town," Daniel volunteered. "The Lazy L. We're in town most Saturdays for supplies." Frank nodded. "If you need anything before the council members come to welcome you, we'll be at the general store for another hour or so." As they rode off, Florence turned to examine what would be her home for the foreseeable future. The cabin was indeed small but appeared sturdy. Inside, she found a single room with a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf. Someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers in a jar on the table, a welcoming touch that brought tears to her eyes after her long journey. Florence had just begun unloading her belongings when a knock came at the door. A woman with silver-streaked dark hair and a kind face stood on the porch holding a covered dish. "Miss Tucker, I'm Dorothy Williams, wife of the mayor. Thought you might appreciate a hot meal after your travels." Florence welcomed her gratefully, and within minutes Dorothy had helped her unpack and was filling her in on the town and its inhabitants. "Frank Lawson's got the biggest cattle spread in these parts," Dorothy explained as they sat at the table sharing the stew she'd brought. "Good man, fair employer. Been through a rough patch since Elizabeth died 3 years back. Typhoid took her and their youngest, a little girl named Sarah." Florence's heart ached at the thought. "That explains the sadness I saw in his eyes," Dorothy nodded. "He doesn't socialize much anymore, keeps to himself except for town business and church. That boy of his is the only bright spot in his life. Smart as a whip, that Daniel." Over the next few weeks, Florence settled into life in Willow Creek. The school had 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, including Daniel Lawson, who proved to be as intelligent as Dorothy had claimed. He devoured books faster than Florence could provide them, and often stayed after class to discuss what he'd read. It was through Daniel that Florence began to learn more about Frank Lawson. The boy spoke of his father with obvious pride and affection, describing how he could track any animal, calm the wildest horse, and had once faced down 3 cattle rustlers single-handedly. "He doesn't laugh much anymore," Daniel confided one afternoon as he helped Florence organize new books that had arrived from Denver. "Not since Mama and Sarah died, but he's a good pa. Reads to me every night, even when he's tired from ranching." Florence felt herself increasingly curious about the widower rancher who rarely came to town, but was spoken of with respect by everyone she met. When she did catch glimpses of him on his Saturday visits, he always tipped his hat politely, but seemed to avoid extended conversation. One stormy afternoon in late October, school had just been dismissed when the skies opened with a vengeance. Rain pounded the schoolhouse roof, as Florence hurried the last students out to waiting parents. She was surprised to see Frank Lawson step through the door, water streaming from his slicker. "Mr. Lawson," she greeted him, "I wasn't expecting you today. Storm's going to get worse," he explained. "Didn't want Daniel riding home alone in it." He glanced around the empty classroom. "Where is he?" Florence felt a flutter of concern. "He left with the Cooper's boy about 10 minutes ago. Said they were heading to the general store before going home." Frank frowned. "They shouldn't be on the trail in this weather. I'd better find them before they leave town." "I'll come with you," Florence said, grabbing her shawl. "Two sets of eyes are better than one." They hurried through the downpour to the general store, but the shopkeeper hadn't seen either boy. With growing concern, they checked the livery stable and several other establishments without success. "They might have headed out already," Frank said, his voice tight with worry. "The creek could be rising with this rain if they tried to cross." Florence laid a hand on his arm. "We'll find them, Mr. Lawson." Together they rode out of town, Frank on his horse and Florence on a borrowed mare from the livery. The rain was relentless, turning the trail to mud and reducing visibility to mere yards. They had gone about 2 miles when Frank suddenly reined in. "There!" he shouted over the storm, pointing to a stand of cottonwoods near the now swollen creek. 2 horses were tied to a tree, and beneath its partial shelter, 2 soaked boys huddled together. Frank was off his horse in an instant, striding toward his son with a mixture of relief and anger. "Daniel, what in blazes were you thinking?" Daniel looked up, his face pale with cold and fear. "Pa, the creek was too high to cross. Jimmy's horse threw a shoe and we didn't know what to do." Frank pulled his son into a brief, fierce hug before examining both boys for injuries. "You did right not trying to cross, but you should have gone back to town." "We were scared you'd be mad we were late," Jimmy Cooper admitted. "I'd rather have you late than drowned," Frank said gruffly. He looked at the creek, which was now a rushing torrent. "We can't cross here. We'll need to head back to town and take the North Bridge." "That's 5 miles out of your way," Florence pointed out. "And it's nearly dark." "The Lawson Ranch is just on the other side, isn't it?" Frank nodded reluctantly. "About half a mile beyond the creek." "Then Jimmy can come home with me," Florence decided. "Mrs. Cooper can collect him when the storm passes, and you should take Daniel to my cabin until morning. It doesn't make sense to risk the longer journey in this weather." Frank hesitated, but another crash of thunder decided the matter. "You're right. Thank you, Miss Tucker." Back in Florence's cabin, she built up the fire while Frank helped the boys out of their wet clothes and wrapped them in blankets. She made hot coffee for the adults and cocoa for the boys, who soon fell asleep on her bed, exhausted by their ordeal. Frank sat at her small table, his large frame making the cabin seem even smaller. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this," he said quietly. "It's no imposition," Florence assured him. "I'm just glad everyone is safe." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rain pound against the roof. "Daniel thinks the world of you," Frank said suddenly. "Says you're the smartest person he's ever met." Florence smiled. "The feeling is mutual. You've raised a remarkable son, Mr. Lawson." "Frank," he corrected her. "Seems silly to stand on formality when we're sharing your cabin in a thunderstorm." "Frank," she agreed, "and I'm Florence." Something in the way he looked at her then made her heart beat faster. His eyes, which she now noticed were a deep green like pine forests, held a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Elizabeth would have liked you," he said softly. "She always said education was a gift beyond price." "She sounds like a wonderful woman." Frank nodded, his expression distant. "She was. Strong, kind, always laughing. When she and Sarah died, it felt like all the music went out of the world." He hesitated. "Daniel says I don't whistle anymore. Used to do it all the time, not even knowing I was doing it." Grief changes us, Florence said gently. I lost my fiancé in a mining accident 6 years ago. For a long time, I couldn't bear to hear music because we used to sing together. Frank's gaze met hers with new understanding. Does it ever stop hurting? Not completely, she admitted. But eventually, you start to remember the joy more than the loss. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their past lives, their hopes and disappointments. Florence told him about growing up in Ohio, losing her parents young, and being raised by an aunt who valued education and independence. Frank spoke of his childhood in Texas, coming to Montana as a young man with dreams of building a cattle empire, and meeting Elizabeth when she came west as a mail-order bride. She was supposed to marry my neighbor, he confessed with a small smile. But she took one look at him and decided his temper was too mean. Asked me to take her in until she could earn enough for a ticket back east. 6 months later we were married. As dawn broke, the storm finally passed. Frank roused Daniel and Jimmy, and Florence provided a simple breakfast of biscuits and preserves before they prepared to leave. "Thank you," Frank said at the door, his hat in his hands. "Not just for the shelter, but for the conversation. It's been a long time since I talked like that to anyone." "You're welcome in my home anytime," Florence replied, surprised by how much she meant it. After that night, something changed between them. Frank began to find reasons to come into town more frequently. He'd stop by the school with books from his own library that he thought Daniel's classmates might enjoy, or bring fresh vegetables from his garden as the harvest came in. Florence found herself looking forward to his visits, to the slow smile that transformed his stern face, to the thoughtful conversations that often stretched into the evening. She began to accept invitations to Sunday dinners at the ranch, where she discovered that Frank was an excellent cook, and that the Lawson home, while simple, was filled with books and handcrafted furniture that spoke of care and permanence. One crisp November afternoon, Florence was supervising the older children on the playground when she noticed Daniel in intense conversation with several other boys. They kept glancing her way, then dissolving into laughter. When she approached, they scattered like quail. What was that about? She asked Daniel. The boy shuffled his feet, looking embarrassed. "Nothing, Miss Tucker. Daniel Lawson, I've never known you to lie to me before," she said gently. "What were you boys discussing?" Daniel sighed. "They were teasing me, saying my pa's sweet on you. Saying he rides into town so much these days just to see you." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "And what did you say to that?" Daniel looked up at her, his expression suddenly serious. "I told them it wouldn't be such a bad thing if it was true. Pa ain't been happy since Mama died, but you make him whistle again." Florence stared at the boy, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. What do you mean I make him whistle?" "He whistles now, when he's getting ready to come to town or when he's reading your letters. He doesn't even know he's doing it." Daniel kicked at a stone. "I miss my mama something fierce, Miss Tucker, but I think she'd want Pa to be happy again." Florence didn't know how to respond, but was saved by the school bell signaling the end of recess. That night, she lay awake for hours, thinking about Frank Lawson and his son, and the new feelings that had been growing in her heart. December brought heavy snow and preparations for the town's Christmas celebration. Florence was busy organizing the school pageant, in which every child had a role to play. Daniel had been cast as one of the 3 wise men and was taking his responsibility very seriously, practicing his lines every day after school. "Pa's making me a special costume," he told Florence proudly. "And he says maybe we could invite you for Christmas dinner, if you don't have other plans." Florence had been intending to accept Dorothy Williams' invitation to join her family, but the hopeful look in Daniel's eyes made her reconsider. "I would be honored to spend Christmas with you and your father," she said. The night of the pageant, the schoolhouse was packed with parents and townspeople. Florence stood at the back, watching nervously as her students performed. When Daniel delivered his lines flawlessly, she caught Frank's eye in the audience. He gave her a smile so full of pride and something deeper that it made her breath catch. After the performance, as families gathered to collect their children and offer congratulations, Frank approached her with a small wrapped package. "Merry Christmas, Florence," he said, handing it to her. "I know it's a few days early, but I wanted to give you this tonight." Florence unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful hand-carved wooden box with wildflowers inlaid in different colored woods on the lid. "Frank, it's exquisite," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Open it," he urged gently. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When she clicked it open, she found a tiny portrait of Daniel on one side. The other side was empty. "It belonged to Elizabeth," Frank explained quietly. "Daniel thought you should have it, the empty side." "Well, we thought you might want to choose what goes there." Florence looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. "This is too precious a gift. I can't accept something that belonged to your wife." Frank took her hands in his. "Elizabeth would want you to have it, and so do I." He hesitated, then added in a low voice, "I never thought I'd feel this way again, Florence. Never thought I'd meet someone who could bring light back into my life the way you have." Around them, parents and children were still celebrating, but Florence barely noticed them. All she could see was the man before her, his eyes revealing feelings that matched her own. "Frank," she began, but was interrupted by Dorothy Williams calling for everyone's attention to announce the serving of refreshments. The moment broken, Frank stepped back. "We'll talk more at Christmas," he promised. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Florence put on her best dress, a deep blue wool with lace at the collar, and pinned her hair up carefully. Around her neck, she wore the silver locket, which now held a tiny photograph of herself that the traveling photographer had taken when he passed through town the previous week. Frank arrived to collect her in a sleigh, Daniel sitting proudly beside him. The boy chatted excitedly all the way to the ranch, telling Florence about the presents he'd already opened that morning and the special dinner his father had prepared. The Lawson home was decorated with pine boughs and candles, a cheerful fire blazing in the hearth. The dining table was set with Elizabeth's best china, and delicious smells wafted from the kitchen. "It's beautiful," Florence said, taking in the cozy scene. "Daniel did most of the decorating," Frank told her, helping her remove her coat. "Said we needed to make it special since you were coming." Dinner was a festive affair, with roast beef, mashed potatoes, carrots glazed with honey, and fresh bread. Daniel kept them entertained with stories from school and questions about Christmases past. When they'd finished eating, he insisted on clearing the table himself. "I need to check on something in my room," he announced mysteriously. "You two talk." As Daniel disappeared down the hall, Frank shook his head with a smile. "Subtle, isn't he?" Florence laughed. "About as subtle as a herd of buffalo." Frank's expression grew serious. "Florence, there's something I need to say to you." He took her hand across the table. "When Elizabeth died, I thought that part of my life was over. I focused on Daniel, on the ranch, on just getting through each day. I didn't expect to ever feel love again." Florence's heart began to race as he continued. "But then you came to town with your books and your ideas and your kindness. You brought color back into a world that had gone gray. You made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow." He squeezed her hand. "Daniel noticed it first. Said I started whistling again after all this time." "He told me," Florence said softly. "He said I make you whistle." Frank's smile was tender. "You do that and more, Florence Tucker. You make me want to build a future again. If you'd consider it, I'd like that future to include you." Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. "Are you proposing, Frank Lawson?" "I am," he said simply. "I love you, Florence, and I hope you might feel something for me too." Before she could answer, Daniel burst back into the room holding something above his head. "Look what I found hanging on the ceiling beam." They both looked up to see Daniel holding a sprig of mistletoe, a mischievous grin on his face. "Daniel," Frank began in a warning tone, but Florence was already laughing. "Your son is indeed as subtle as a herd of buffalo," she said, rising from her chair. "But in this case, I believe we should honor the tradition." She moved around the table to stand before Frank, who got to his feet looking both hopeful and uncertain. "You haven't answered my question," he reminded her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the happy tears threatening to spill over. "Yes, I will marry you, Frank Lawson." His face lit with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of love both new and enduring. Daniel whooped with delight, dancing around them with the mistletoe still clutched in his hand. "I knew it," the boy crowed. "I knew you'd say yes." When they finally broke apart, Florence kept her arms around Frank's waist, unwilling to let go. "How long have you two been plotting this?" she asked, looking from father to son. Daniel grinned. "Since the storm. Pa couldn't stop talking about you after that night." Frank had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "He's exaggerating, but not by much." They spent the rest of Christmas Day planning their future together. They would marry in the spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the prairie. Florence would continue teaching until the end of the school year, then decide whether to stay on or focus on helping Frank with the ranch and perhaps starting a family of their own. "I have a Christmas gift for you two," Florence told Frank as the evening drew to a close. From her handbag, she withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Frank opened it carefully to find a silver pocket watch. Engraved on the back were the words, "For all our tomorrows. With love, Florence." "It's perfect," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I'll carry it always." Daniel, who had been watching them with satisfaction, suddenly yawned widely. "I think I'll go to bed now," he announced. "You probably want to kiss some more." Frank laughed, a full, rich sound that Florence realized she'd never heard from him before. Smart boy. "But you're right about bedtime. It's been a big day." After Daniel had been tucked in, Frank and Florence sat before the fire, her head resting on his shoulder as they talked softly about their hopes for the years ahead. "I never expected to find love in Willow Creek," Florence confessed. "I came here to start over, not knowing what I was looking for." "And I wasn't looking at all," Frank replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But sometimes life brings you exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it." As the fire burned low, Florence heard a soft sound and realized that Frank was whistling a gentle tune, probably unaware he was doing so. She smiled and snuggled closer, her heart full to bursting with love for this man and his son who had become her family. Spring arrived in Montana with a riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. On a perfect May morning, with the scent of sage and prairie roses filling the air, Florence Tucker became Florence Lawson in a simple ceremony attended by the entire town of Willow Creek. Daniel stood proudly at his father's side, beaming as Florence joined them at the altar. "We're a family now," he whispered as she took her place beside them, "just like I wished for." As Frank took her hands in his, Florence knew that she had found not just a husband but a home, a place where love had been reborn from grief, and where the sound of whistling would fill their days for years to come.